Christopher Martinez, a 34-year-old IT systems analyst and father of 2 young children, thought his biggest challenge was managing the mounting medical bills from his wife Sarah's recent surgery while keeping their family's daily routine intact. Then, Brenda Kellerman knocked on their door at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, demanding he retract his malicious complaint about her German Shepherd. What unfolded over the next 6 weeks would test everything he believed about neighborhood safety, standing up to bullies, and protecting the people he loved most. Before this story begins, consider, how well do you really know the person who holds power over your home? This happened just 8 months ago in a planned community outside Phoenix, Arizona. The family still lives there today, and their security footage changed everything. After hearing this, you'll never assume HOA leadership operates with good intentions again. The morning started like any other Tuesday in the Willowbrook Estates subdivision. Chris was helping 8-year-old Emma find her missing math homework while 6-year-old Tyler practiced tying his shoes for the 100th time. Sarah, still recovering from her gallbladder surgery 3 weeks earlier, moved carefully around the kitchen, preparing lunchboxes with a methodical precision that made her such an excellent pediatric nurse. The medical bills were piling up despite their insurance, but they were managing. Chris had picked up extra consulting work. Sarah would return to the hospital in another week. And their modest 2-story home felt like the sanctuary they'd worked so hard to create. The aggressive knocking shattered the peaceful morning routine. Chris opened the front door to find Brenda Kellerman, the Willowbrook HOA president, standing on his porch with her arms crossed and fury radiating from every line of her 52-year-old frame. Behind her, barely contained by a flimsy retractable leash, stood Zeus, her massive German Shepherd, panting and pulling toward Chris with an intensity that made his stomach clench. Brenda's voice cut through the morning air like broken glass. She demanded Chris immediately withdraw the vindictive complaint he'd filed about Zeus being off-leash in the common areas. Her words came rapid fire, each sentence designed to intimidate and overwhelm. She accused him of targeting her personally, of trying to undermine her authority, of being the kind of troublemaker who destroyed neighborhood harmony. The dog strained against the leash, and Chris noticed the retractable line was already extended nearly 20 feet, technically making Zeus unleashed according to the HOA's own pet policies. Chris tried to explain calmly that he'd simply reported what he'd witnessed 3 days earlier. Zeus had been running free in Willowbrook Park while Emma and Tyler played on the swings. When the massive dog had charged toward Tyler, barking aggressively, Chris had scooped up his 6-year-old son and called for the dog's owner. Brenda had emerged from behind the tennis courts, clearly annoyed at being bothered, and had made no effort to apologize or control Zeus. She'd simply clipped on the leash and walked away, muttering something about paranoid parents loud enough for Chris to hear. The HOA pet policy was crystal clear: all dogs must remain leashed at all times in common areas, with leashes no longer than 6 feet. Chris had submitted a standard complaint form through the HOA website, documenting the date, time, and location of the violation. He'd included no personal commentary, no demands for specific punishment, just the factual details required by the complaint process Brenda's own board had established. But standing on his porch that morning, watching Brenda's face contort with indignation, Chris realized this wasn't about pet policies or neighborhood safety. This was about power, control, and what happened when someone dared to challenge Brenda Kellerman's authority in her domain. Brenda's voice dropped to a menacing whisper as she leaned closer to Chris's doorway. She reminded him that she'd been HOA president for 7 years, that she knew every rule and regulation better than any resident, and that she had the authority to make life very difficult for families who caused problems. Her words carried the weight of threat barely concealed beneath a veneer of official procedure. She mentioned the small garden Sarah had planted beside their front steps, questioning whether the native desert plants technically violated the landscaping guidelines. She noted that their garage door had been left open past the permitted hours several times recently, something she'd been monitoring during her evening walks. Chris felt his chest tighten as he realized Brenda had been watching his family, cataloging minor infractions, building a case for retaliation. The morning sun felt suddenly cold as the implications settled over him like a dark cloud. This woman controlled the entity that could find them, force expensive modifications to their home, and make their lives miserable through bureaucratic warfare. And she was making it clear that reporting her unleashed dog had marked them as enemies. Emma appeared at Chris's elbow, curious about the commotion. and Zeus immediately focused his attention on the 8-year-old girl. The dog's body language shifted, ears forward, muscles tensed, and Chris instinctively stepped between his daughter and the animal. Brenda made no effort to control Zeus's intense focus on the child. Instead, she used Emma's presence to drive her point home more forcefully. She spoke about how unfortunate it would be if the Martinez family found themselves facing multiple violations and escalating fines, especially given their obvious financial pressures. The threat hung in the morning air like poison gas. Chris's IT training had taught him to document everything, but his father's heart screamed at him to grab his daughter and slam the door on this woman and her barely controlled animal. Instead, he managed to keep his voice steady as he told Brenda he had every right to report safety violations and that he expected HOA leadership to follow the same rules as everyone else. Brenda's laugh was cold and sharp. She informed Chris that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his brief residency in Willowbrook Estates. As she turned to leave, Zeus lunged toward Emma one final time, stopped only by the retractable leash that extended far beyond the 6-foot limit. Chris swept his daughter behind him and watched as Brenda walked away, making no effort to control her dog's aggressive behavior toward a child. That evening, Chris researched everything he could find about HOA law, resident rights, and complaint procedures. His systematic approach to problems had served him well in IT, and he applied the same methodology to understanding the complex web of rules and regulations that governed their community. What he discovered both reassured and alarmed him. Residents did have rights, complaints could be filed anonymously, and HOA boards were bound by state laws regarding fair treatment and due process. But he also learned that vindictive HOA leadership could make life unbearable for families through selective enforcement, excessive fines, and bureaucratic harassment. Sarah listened to his account of the morning confrontation while helping Tyler with his bedtime routine. Her nursing background had taught her to recognize dangerous behavior patterns, and everything about Chris's description of Brenda's threats and Zeus's aggression raised red flags. She'd worked pediatric emergency rooms long enough to know that dog attacks on children were devastating and often preventable. The fact that the HOA president herself was allowing an aggressive dog to run unleashed in areas where children played was unconscionable. They made the decision together that night. Chris would not withdraw his complaint. They would document every interaction with Brenda and the HOA board. And they would install a comprehensive security camera system to protect their family and their property. Chris had been meaning to upgrade their basic doorbell camera anyway, and Sarah's recent surgery had reminded them both how quickly life could change. They couldn't afford to be vulnerable to someone who had already demonstrated she was willing to use her position for personal vendettas. The security system installation took Chris most of the following Saturday. He positioned cameras to cover their front door, driveway, both sides of the house, and the backyard where Emma and Tyler played. The main hub connected to their home Wi-Fi and automatically uploaded footage to cloud storage, creating a permanent record of everything that happened on their property. Chris's IT expertise made the setup seamless, and by Sunday evening they had complete coverage of their home's perimeter. The first retaliation came exactly 1 week after Brenda's threatening visit. Chris found an official HOA violation notice tucked into their front door, citing unauthorized landscaping modifications in reference to Sarah's small desert garden. The notice demanded immediate removal of all plants not specifically approved through the Architectural Review Committee, with daily fines of $50 beginning in 7 days if compliance was not achieved. Chris photographed the garden from every angle and spent his lunch break researching the HOA's architectural guidelines. The relevant section was deliberately vague, requiring appropriate desert landscaping that maintains community aesthetic standards. Sarah's plants were all native Arizona species, drought-resistant and perfectly suited to their climate. More importantly, Chris discovered that at least 15 other homes in their immediate area had similar or more extensive gardens that had never been cited for violations. That evening, Chris walked through Willowbrook Estates with his phone, documenting every landscape variation he could find. The evidence was overwhelming. Decorative rocks arranged in elaborate patterns, cacti gardens far more extensive than Sarah's modest plot, fruit trees that definitely weren't native to Arizona, and even a few homes with small vegetable gardens tucked beside their garages. None of these had received violation notices, despite being far more obvious than Sarah's carefully planned desert plant arrangement. The selective enforcement was so blatant that Chris felt confident appealing the violation. He prepared a comprehensive response, including photographs of Sarah's garden, documentation of similar landscaping throughout the community, and references to the specific HOA guidelines that supported their compliance. He submitted the appeal through proper channels and waited for the board's response. Brenda's reply came not through official HOA channels, but through a handwritten note left on his windshield. The message was brief and chilling. Some people never learn when to stop pushing. Your family's comfort depends on your cooperation. The note was unsigned, but Chris recognized Brenda's handwriting from HOA documents they'd received over the years. Sarah stared at the note that evening, her nursing instincts recognizing the escalation pattern of an unstable personality. She'd seen this before in patients' family members who couldn't handle being challenged or corrected. The progression from verbal threats to written intimidation suggested Brenda was losing her grip on appropriate boundaries. Sarah insisted they report the harassment to local police, but Chris hesitated. What crime had actually been committed? A vague note left on a windshield in their own driveway wouldn't interest busy police officers. And involving law enforcement might escalate the situation beyond their control. Instead, Chris focused on documentation. He photographed the note, recorded the date and time it was discovered, and filed everything in a growing folder of HOA-related incidents. His methodical approach to conflict had always served him well, and he believed that building a paper trail would eventually protect his family from Brenda's harassment. The second violation notice arrived 5 days later, this time citing garage door policy violations. According to the complaint, the Martinez family had been observed leaving their garage door open beyond the permitted hours on multiple occasions over the past 2 weeks. The fine was $75 per violation with 8 separate incidents documented, totaling $600 in penalties. Chris read the notice 3 times, feeling his stomach sink with each review. The HOA's garage door policy limited open doors to periods of active use, with a maximum of 30 minutes for loading or unloading activities. But the policy was routinely ignored throughout Willowbrook Estates, with many families leaving their garage doors open during nice weather, while children played in driveways, or when residents were working on projects in their garages. More disturbing was the level of surveillance the violation notice implied. Someone had been watching their house closely enough to document specific dates and times when their garage door was open. The incidents listed corresponded to evenings when Chris had been doing consulting work in the garage, weekend mornings when the kids played with sidewalk chalk in the driveway, and the afternoons Sarah had been organizing medical equipment after returning from the hospital. The realization hit Chris like cold water. Brenda was stalking his family. She was driving by their house, taking notes, building cases for harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. The woman who controlled their community's rules and regulations was using her position to conduct personal vendettas against anyone who dared to challenge her authority. That night, Chris reviewed footage from their new security cameras, searching for evidence of Brenda's surveillance. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. The cameras had captured Brenda's car driving slowly past their house at least twice daily for the past 10 days. She'd been photographing their property with her cell phone during several of these drive-bys, always from the public street, but clearly focused on their home specifically. More troubling were the evening visits. Brenda had been walking Zeus past their house every night around 8 o'clock, always stopping at the edge of their property to let the dog sniff around their mailbox and front landscaping. The German Shepherd's body language on camera was consistently aggressive, ears forward and muscles tense as he focused on their front door. During 2 of these visits, Emma and Tyler had been playing in the backyard, and the security cameras captured Zeus becoming agitated by the sound of the children's voices, pulling toward the house with obvious intent. Sarah watched the security footage with growing alarm. Her medical training helped her recognize predatory behavior patterns, and everything about Brenda's actions suggested escalation toward more direct confrontation. The systematic surveillance, the use of her dog as an intimidation tool, and the increasingly personal nature of her harassment were classic warning signs of someone whose psychological boundaries were dissolving. They made the decision to install additional motion-activated lights around their property, and to keep the children inside during evening hours until the situation stabilized. Chris also began varying his work schedule and departure times, making it harder for Brenda to predict their family's routine. The precautions felt simultaneously necessary and absurd. They were essentially hiding from their HOA president in their own neighborhood. The harassment continued to escalate over the following weeks. A third violation notice cited inappropriate noise levels during weekend hours, referencing times when Emma and Tyler had been playing in their backyard. The children's voices and laughter were characterized as disruptive to neighborhood tranquility, with fines totaling $300 for multiple violations over a 2-week period. Chris researched noise ordinances and discovered that the HOA's quiet hours didn't even begin until 10 p.m. on weekends. Emma and Tyler had been playing outside during perfectly legal hours, engaging in normal childhood activities in their own fenced backyard. The violation notice was completely baseless, but it demonstrated how Brenda was weaponizing her position to attack his family from every possible angle. A fourth notice arrived 3 days later, this time targeting their trash bin placement. According to the complaint, they were positioning their garbage containers too close to the street, creating an aesthetic disruption that violated community standards. The fine was $150, with photographic evidence attached showing their bins in exactly the same position used by every other household on their street. The photographic evidence was particularly disturbing because it revealed just how closely Brenda was monitoring their property. The images were taken from multiple angles and at different times of day, suggesting she was making special trips to document their supposed violations. In some photos, Chris could see Emma's bicycle in their driveway and Tyler's soccer ball on their front lawn, evidence that Brenda was photographing their home while their children were outside playing. Sarah reached her breaking point that evening. As a pediatric nurse, she'd spent years protecting children from dangerous adults, and every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings about Brenda Kellerman. The escalating surveillance, the targeting of their children's normal activities, and the use of an aggressive dog for intimidation were textbook behaviors of someone building toward more serious harassment or even violence. She insisted they contact police immediately, regardless of whether criminal charges could be filed. They needed official documentation of Brenda's behavior pattern, and law enforcement needed to be aware that an HOA president was using her position to stalk and harass a family with young children. Chris agreed, finally understanding that his methodical approach to documentation was insufficient protection against someone whose behavior was becoming increasingly unstable. Detective Morrison from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office arrived at their home on a Thursday evening, just as Chris was helping Tyler with homework and Sarah was preparing dinner. The detective was a 15-year veteran with experience in harassment and stalking cases, and he listened carefully as Chris and Sarah described the escalating pattern of Brenda's behavior. Detective Morrison reviewed their documentation with the thoroughness Chris had hoped for. The security camera footage of Brenda's repeated drive-bys and evening walks with Zeus was particularly compelling evidence of surveillance. The progression of increasingly frivolous HOA violations, combined with the threatening note left on Chris's windshield, painted a clear picture of harassment disguised as official HOA business. The detective explained that while HOA disputes were generally civil matters, Brenda's behavior was crossing into criminal harassment territory. The systematic surveillance, written threats, and use of an aggressive dog for intimidation were serious concerns that warranted police attention. He advised them to continue documenting everything and to call immediately if Brenda's behavior escalated to any form of direct confrontation or physical intimidation. Detective Morrison also shared information that sent chills through Chris and Sarah. The sheriff's office had received 3 previous complaints about Brenda Kellerman over the past 2 years, all from Willowbrook Estates residents who'd reported similar patterns of harassment after challenging HOA decisions. None of the previous complaints had resulted in charges, but they established a concerning pattern of behavior that supported Chris and Sarah's allegations. The detective's visit seemed to provide temporary relief. Brenda's drive-bys stopped immediately, and no new violation notices appeared for nearly a week. Chris began to hope that official police involvement had scared Brenda into backing down from her harassment campaign. Sarah remained cautious, reminding Chris that people with control issues often escalated their behavior when challenged by authority figures. Sarah's instincts proved correct in the most devastating way possible. The attack on their property occurred exactly 8 days after Detective Morrison's visit. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, when the entire Martinez family was asleep, their security cameras captured everything in horrifying detail. The footage showed Brenda Kellerman approaching their driveway on foot, dressed in dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a set of keys. She moved directly to Chris's Honda Civic, parked in their driveway next to Sarah's SUV, and began systematically keying long scratches down both sides of the vehicle. The camera angle captured her face clearly as she worked, revealing an expression of concentrated rage that was chilling to witness. But Brenda wasn't finished with property damage alone. After completing her work on the car's paint, she pulled a small knife from her jacket pocket and methodically punctured both front tires. The hissing sound of escaping air was audible on the security recording, and Brenda stood watching until both tires were completely flat. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes, but the cameras captured every detail with perfect clarity. Brenda's face was clearly visible, her actions were deliberate and systematic, and her behavior demonstrated someone who had completely abandoned any pretense of legal or ethical boundaries. She'd graduated from harassment to criminal vandalism, attacking the property of a family with young children in the middle of the night. Chris discovered the damage the next morning when he went outside to leave for work. The scratches on his car were deep enough to reach the metal, requiring professional bodywork that would cost thousands of dollars. The slashed tires were beyond repair, and he had to call in late to work while arranging for towing and tire replacement. But more than the financial impact, the attack represented a psychological violation that left the entire family feeling unsafe in their own home. Sarah's reaction to viewing the security footage was immediate and visceral. Watching Brenda's face as she systematically destroyed their property revealed the depth of rage and instability they were dealing with. This wasn't someone who was going to be deterred by official warnings or legal procedures. This was someone whose psychological boundaries had completely dissolved, who was willing to commit serious crimes to maintain control over what she perceived as her domain. Detective Morrison arrived within 2 hours of Chris's call, and his expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the security footage. The video evidence was absolutely conclusive, showing Brenda's face clearly as she committed multiple felonies on the Martinez family's property. The detective immediately began the process for arrest warrants, explaining that vandalism and property destruction charges would be filed within 24 hours. But the detective also shared information that made the situation even more serious. A search of police records revealed that Brenda had been arrested twice in other jurisdictions for similar behavior, including a vandalism incident at her previous residence and a harassment case that had resulted in a restraining order. The Martinez family wasn't dealing with a first-time offender having a mental breakdown. They were dealing with someone with a documented history of escalating criminal behavior. The arrest occurred the following afternoon while Brenda was showing a house to potential buyers in her role as a real estate agent. Detective Morrison and 2 additional officers took her into custody in front of her clients, a humiliation that seemed fitting given how she'd used her position to terrorize the Martinez family. The charges included criminal damage to property, trespassing, and harassment, with bail set at $15,000. News of Brenda's arrest spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire, and Chris began receiving calls and visits from neighbors he barely knew. The conversations revealed a pattern of abuse that went far beyond what his family had experienced. Multiple residents described similar harassment campaigns after challenging Brenda's decisions or reporting violations involving her own property. Margaret Willis, an elderly widow 3 streets over, described how Brenda had targeted her with noise complaints after Margaret had questioned excessive HOA fees during a board meeting. The harassment had included repeated citations for her small flower garden and threats to force her to repaint her house at a cost she couldn't afford on her fixed income. David and Lisa Chen, a young couple with a newborn, had faced similar retaliation after reporting that HOA landscaping crews had damaged their sprinkler system. Brenda had responded with a campaign of frivolous violations and threats that had left them considering selling their home despite loving the neighborhood. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Brenda had been using her position as HOA president to conduct personal vendettas against anyone who dared to question her authority. She'd weaponized HOA rules and regulations to silence dissent, control her neighbors, and maintain absolute power over the community she claimed to serve. As word of the abuse spread, more residents came forward with their own stories. The scope of Brenda's misconduct was staggering, involving selective enforcement of rules, financial irregularities, and systematic intimidation of families who challenged her decisions. Chris realized that his family's experience, while traumatic, was just the tip of an iceberg of corruption and abuse that had been festering for years. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 3 days after Brenda's arrest, and Chris attended to ensure their family's complaints were properly addressed. The remaining board members seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of Brenda's misconduct. claiming they had been unaware of her harassment campaigns and criminal behavior. However, Chris's research into HOA meeting minutes and financial records suggested that Brenda's behavior hadn't occurred in complete isolation. Board members had approved many of the frivolous fines and violations that were central to her harassment campaigns, and they'd failed to investigate multiple resident complaints about her conduct over the years. The meeting became heated as affected residents demanded accountability not just from Brenda but from the board members who had enabled her behavior through negligence or willful blindness. Chris found himself emerging as a leader among the aggrieved homeowners, his documentation and systematic approach providing the factual foundation needed to demand real change. Sarah watched her husband's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. The quiet professional who preferred to avoid conflict had become a fierce advocate for his family and community, but the stress of leading this fight was taking its toll. He was working late into the night researching HOA law and organizing documentation from other affected residents, all while maintaining his regular job and helping with Emma and Tyler's care. The legal proceedings against Brenda moved forward with satisfying swiftness. Her criminal defense attorney attempted to characterize the vandalism as an isolated incident caused by personal stress, but the prosecution had access to Chris's meticulously documented evidence of systematic harassment, as well as similar complaints from other residents. The security camera footage was devastating evidence that left no room for denial or excuse. The video clearly showed Brenda's premeditated approach to the Martinez property, her systematic destruction of their car, and her complete awareness of the criminal nature of her actions. Combined with evidence of her surveillance and harassment campaign, the footage painted a picture of someone whose behavior had escalated far beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct. Detective Morrison testified about the pattern of complaints against Brenda and her history of similar behavior in other communities. The prosecutor presented evidence that Brenda had used her position as HOA president to conduct personal vendettas against multiple families, creating a climate of fear and intimidation that violated both criminal law and her fiduciary duties to the community. Brenda's trial lasted 3 days, and Chris testified about his family's experience with careful precision. He described the escalating harassment, the impact on his children's ability to play safely in their neighborhood, and the financial and emotional costs of dealing with someone who had weaponized community leadership for personal revenge. Sarah's testimony was particularly powerful as she described the fear and stress that Brenda's behavior had created for their entire family. She spoke about having to explain to Emma and Tyler why they couldn't play outside during certain hours, about the anxiety of never knowing when the next frivolous violation notice would arrive, and about the violation of trust that occurred when community leadership was used for personal harassment. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Brenda was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, 3 years probation, and ordered to pay full restitution for the damage to Chris's vehicle, plus additional fines and court costs. She was also banned from holding any HOA leadership position for 10 years effectively, ending her ability to use community governance for personal vendettas. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning of accountability for Brenda's misconduct. Chris had filed civil lawsuits on behalf of his family and other affected residents, seeking damages for harassment, property damage, and the emotional distress caused by years of abuse. The civil cases were strengthened by Brenda's criminal conviction and the extensive documentation that multiple families had maintained. The HOA itself faced significant legal exposure for failing to properly supervise Brenda and for enabling her harassment campaigns through negligent oversight. Chris's research had uncovered financial irregularities and procedural violations that suggested broader problems with the community's governance beyond just Brenda's personal misconduct. As the legal proceedings continued, Chris found himself at the center of a community transformation that went far beyond holding one abusive leader accountable. Residents who had been silent about HOA problems for years began speaking up about issues they'd been afraid to raise. Families who had considered moving because of harassment began working together to create real change in their neighborhood. The HOA board was completely reconstituted following Brenda's conviction, with Chris and several other affected residents winning election to leadership positions. Their first priority was implementing transparency and accountability measures that would prevent future abuse of power. They established clear procedures for resident complaints, created independent oversight of enforcement actions, and implemented financial controls that would prevent misuse of community funds. More importantly, they worked to heal the climate of fear and division that Brenda's leadership had created. Community events were organized to rebuild neighborly relationships, communication channels were opened to ensure resident concerns were heard and addressed, and policies were implemented to protect families from retaliatory enforcement actions. The transformation wasn't instant or complete, but it represented genuine progress toward the kind of community Chris and Sarah had hoped to join when they'd bought their home in Willowbrook Estates. Their children could play safely in the neighborhood parks, families could express concerns without fear of retaliation, and community leadership was focused on serving residents rather than controlling them. Chris's role in this transformation had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The quiet professional who had once avoided conflict had learned that sometimes protecting what matters most requires finding the courage to stand up against people who abuse their power. His methodical approach and documentation skills had provided the foundation for legal accountability, but the real victory was helping create a community where families could thrive without fear. Sarah watched her husband's growth with deep admiration. The man who had been intimidated by Brenda's initial threats had become someone willing to testify in court, lead community meetings, and hold elected officials accountable for their actions. His transformation hadn't changed his essential character, but it had revealed strengths he'd never known he possessed. The financial impact of their ordeal was ultimately manageable. Insurance covered most of the vehicle damage, the civil lawsuit provided compensation for their additional expenses, and Chris's consulting work had grown as his reputation for thorough documentation and problem-solving had spread beyond their community. More importantly, their family had emerged stronger and more confident in their ability to handle whatever challenges life might bring. Emma and Tyler had learned important lessons about standing up to bullies and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. They'd watched their parents work together to solve a serious problem, and they'd seen that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage and persistence even when it's difficult or scary. The security camera system that had captured Brenda's criminal behavior remained active, but Chris no longer monitored it with the anxiety that had characterized their first months in the house. The cameras now provided normal peace of mind rather than evidence gathering for an ongoing harassment campaign. Their home felt like a sanctuary again, earned through their willingness to fight for their family's safety and dignity. Detective Morrison later told Chris that their case had become a training example for other law enforcement agencies dealing with HOA-related harassment. The systematic documentation and security footage had provided a textbook example of how to build a criminal case against someone who is using community leadership positions for personal vendettas. The detective's investigation had also revealed connections between Brenda's behavior and similar problems in other communities. Her pattern of harassment and retaliation had followed her through multiple HOA leadership positions, suggesting that the problem of abusive community leaders was more widespread than most people realized. Chris began speaking at HOA conferences and community meetings about the importance of accountability and transparency in neighborhood governance. His message was simple but powerful. Community leadership is a privilege that carries serious responsibilities, and residents have both the right and the obligation to hold their leaders accountable when those responsibilities are violated. The Martinez family's story had become more than just their personal struggle against an abusive HOA president. It had become a catalyst for broader conversations about power, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or risky. 2 years later, Willowbrook Estates had become known as a model community for transparent and accountable governance. Property values had increased as families were attracted to a neighborhood where leadership was focused on service rather than control. The playground where Zeus had once terrorized children was filled with kids playing safely under the watchful eyes of parents who no longer feared retaliation for speaking up about problems. Brenda completed her jail sentence and moved to a different state, where she was prohibited from holding HOA leadership positions due to her criminal record. The community she had terrorized through abuse of power had not only survived her harassment but had emerged stronger and more united than before. Chris still maintained his methodical approach to problem solving, but he'd learned that documentation and legal procedures were only tools in service of a larger purpose, protecting the people and principles that matter most. His transformation from conflict-avoidant neighbor to community leader hadn't changed his essential character, but it had revealed the courage that had always been there, waiting for circumstances that demanded its emergence. The Ring doorbell that had started as a simple security measure had ended up providing the evidence that brought a criminal to justice and helped heal an entire community. But the real security it provided was the knowledge that sometimes ordinary people, armed with nothing but determination and the truth, can prevail against those who abuse their power. Sarah often reflected on how their ordeal had strengthened not just their family but their entire neighborhood. The nurses in her unit at the hospital frequently dealt with the aftermath of domestic violence and abuse, and she'd seen how victims could be empowered by watching others successfully stand up to their tormentors. The Martinez family's victory had given hope to other families dealing with similar harassment, showing that abusive behavior could be stopped when people found the courage to document it and seek help. The children in Willowbrook Estates grew up knowing that their voices mattered, that unfair treatment could be challenged, and that sometimes standing up for what's right was more important than avoiding conflict. Emma and Tyler carried these lessons into their school lives, showing kindness to classmates who were being bullied and confidence in their ability to handle difficult situations. The community that had once been divided by fear and intimidation became known for its collaborative approach to solving problems and its commitment to protecting all families, regardless of their willingness to challenge authority. The playground laughter that had once been cited as a noise violation was now celebrated as the sound of children growing up in a neighborhood where they were safe to be kids. As Chris tucked Tyler into bed one evening, his 6-year-old son asked if bad people like Miss Brenda might come back to hurt their family. Chris was able to answer with complete honesty that their neighborhood was now protected by people who cared about doing what was right, and that sometimes when families work together, they can make sure that bullies can never hurt anyone again. The Ring doorbell still monitored their front porch, but Chris no longer watched the footage with anxiety. Instead, it captured birthday parties and neighborhood barbecues, children playing safely in their front yard, and neighbors stopping by to chat without fear of retaliation. The security it provided was no longer protection from a specific threat, but rather the peace of mind that comes from living in a community where leadership serves families rather than terrorizing them. Chris's story had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they find the courage to stand up for what matters most. The quieted professional who had once avoided conflict had learned that sometimes protecting family requires discovering strength you never knew you had, and that the fight for justice and accountability is always worth the cost when it protects the people you love and the principles that make communities strong. And if this situation unfolded in your neighborhood, would you find the courage to stand up like Chris did? Sometimes protecting what matters most requires us to discover strength we never knew we had. The bullies who abuse positions of trust count on good people staying silent, avoiding conflict, and hoping someone else will solve the problem. But when we document the truth, seek help from proper authorities, and work together with our neighbors, we have the power to create communities where families can thrive with dignity and safety. The Ring doorbell footage that brought Brenda to justice wasn't just technology, it was evidence that ordinary people, armed with truth and determination, can hold even the most powerful community leaders accountable for their actions.